This week on Podcast Perspectives, if someone has a great idea but no pilot, what is the minimum that they should bring into the room with you?
I mean, there should still be a pitch, right? What is the show? Who is it for? What is the format and structure of episodes? What is the tone of it, right? You can tell me a lot about the show without me ever hearing a single piece of audio.
Today's guest is Wondery Eaton, one of the most influential people behind the scenes in podcasting. She's led programming at NPR, Apple Podcasts, Netflix, and Wondery, deciding which shows get made and how they reach listeners. Now she's advising major brands as an independent development consultant at her new organization, Type C Studios. We're going to talk about how big companies think about budgets and risk, and what actually makes a show worth greenlighting for listeners. Welcome to the show, Wondery.
Thank you so much.
You've essentially held greenlighting power at NPR, Apple, Netflix, Wondery, all in just a handful of years. How do you describe what you actually do when you walk into a new organization?
I really feel like on paper, right, it's like I'm a podcast development executive, right? But I feel like, to me, what I'm really good at is being a connector and connecting with creatives, be they journalists or filmmakers or any kind of storytellers, and help to enable them to tell their story, to get their story out in the best way possible. That's what I feel like my job is. And I also feel like big part of my job is kind of like removing obstacles out of the way so people can do their best work as creatives, right? So whether that's like, helping to build a team to support the story, or working with marketing to make sure like the messaging is right and we have the right plan to meet the right audience, or sales, whatever it is. I feel like everything I do is in service of the story and in service of the creative I'm working with.
And I know the business model is different at each of the organizations that you've worked at, but like how core and key to like greenlighting something is the idea of like, can this ultimately achieve my goal?
Oh, it's absolutely completely key, right? And not every show has hit every goal, right? Because then you'd be
You
making
would be even more of a phenom if that was true.
yeah, but it's also like unrealistic, right? So you have like every place I've ever gone to, ever worked at, you have your business goals. And some shows like, you say like, we need to have a certain amount of revenue. Some shows like this is a really good show, but also it's like it's our biggest revenue driver. Sometimes it's like we need to get an audience that we don't yet have, right? So this show, that if you don't have that audience already, it's not going to be your biggest revenue driver necessarily, but it's trying to get you closer to getting an audience that you don't already have. So it serves a purpose over here. But no matter what, it really has to still serve a purpose, and it has to be a kind of a portfolio approach, right? Like every show is like a kind of a team player and it knows its role.
Yeah, it's like a stepping stone for like the broader organization.
Yeah.
So you started at NPR and you were charged with bringing in new programming and audiences. What did new audiences mean in practice, and how did you measure success?
Before I was at NPR, I never worked in podcasts before, but I worked in public television. So I worked in documentary film for like 15 years before moving into podcasts. And I worked for this really great organization called Independent Television Service, ITVS. Just a tiny, tiny portion of your tax dollars goes towards this organization to fund independent documentary filmmakers. And then those films would then end up on PBS. So was doing that and was really focused on bringing younger and more diverse filmmakers to PBS. So it's not just Ken Burns, God bless Ken Burns, but let someone else have a crack at it. And so I did that pretty successfully at ITVS. So that's why NPR brought me on. And at the time, my boss who recruited me was a senior vice president of programming, Anya Grundman. And she totally recognized that unless NPR's audience diversifies, gets younger and more diverse, like, it's an aging audience, right? And so my job was to figure out how to do that. And a big component of that is that NPR had never developed shows with people externally. And that includes member stations. They weren't, developing new podcasts with member stations either. So having to go in from the start and set up a system, basically an intake and evaluation system for both external careers at large, but also member stations. So that was a big part of what my role was and what I was really focused on there.
You were very successful by most standards in that regard. I know several years later, NPR dismantled a lot of the work that you and other folks at the org had done. But those were successful shows when it came to driving audiences. And as you just said, a net new audience doesn't necessarily mean net new revenue on day one.
Yeah.
If you could go back, would you have done anything there differently?
Some things are out of my hands and some things aren't. One of the things I did at NPR my first year was I spent like 3 months talking to people across the company, talking to them about shows, both podcasts and radio programs that were created with diverse audiences in mind and were staffed and developed by people of color, understanding like what went wrong, like why does that show no longer exist? And a lot of it was like, how are you properly staffing a show and setting up for success? Like, what are the metrics you're putting up against it? And a thing I saw consistently was that they're giving a show hosted by a person of color, geared towards a Black audience or Latinx audience, greenlighting it, but then with like not the amount of staff actually necessary to make an ongoing show.
Yeah, no marketing budget, half the producers that somebody else would get.
And not the marketing budget. Yeah. But then expecting to perform kind of the same way.
Let's make the same amount of money. That would be great with half the resources.
And they're like, oh, they're setting up for failure, right? And so I took a lot of those lessons into how I was setting up Throughline before that was launched. And that shows success and kind of growing incrementally, right? But I do think like towards my later time there, I was developing a show where, I don't know, we were like, I don't know, in the haze of podcasting craze where people were stealing producers from companies. It's like 2019, 2020. And I think that rigidity around budgets and starting small kind of lapsed a bit. And I think that led to the situation I was trying to avoid. So that's something I wish I could have done. Because then once I left, right, doesn't matter if I'm there or not. I would have like really prepared it for a long-term success.
We touched on this a second ago, but can you walk through the first external submission process? What problems was that solving internally? And what did it change for creators on the outside? And if you have any specific examples, I would love to hear them.
It was great that NPR was like, we want to develop shows with people externally now, but there's no mechanism to do it. It required lots of like approval and buy-in from like legal department, right, and finance and the newsroom. But most importantly, it meant having to like basically restart relationships with external like freelance reporters, producers who had either pitched stories to news managers don't know or try to pitch shows and were like really doors closed firmly in their face. And I remember I went to my first Third Coast in November of 2016 when I started. I had started like 4 months before. And I was telling people what I do. I'm like, oh, we have this thing called the Story Lab and please submit. And like people were cold. Like they're like, I don't know you. I know NPR though. I don't trust NPR. You guys aren't serious. You don't really want to work with me. And so I would say that first year was just trying to prove to people like, no, this is not some elaborate prank. Like I really want to work with you, but it required a lot of like field and trust building first.
Just for listeners who may not know, NPR is a broadcast first organization that had been working in podcasting for a long time, longer than most. However, they developed everything through like their own internal resources and talent. There's a lot of pitching that's happening left and right where people are trying to get their stories placed everywhere. And so you're saying that people at Third Coast, which is both broadcast and podcast, but like much more on like the creative production side of things.
Mm.
It sounds like a lot of them had been burned historically, like trying to get their stuff picked up on
Yeah.
NPR, whether it's with existing shows or pitching new ones.
Yes.
And so this represent your job and your role, and one of the tasks that you had represented a big shift in how you guys had been approaching things historically, but it required you to like get buy-in from the community.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It didn't even require a show being greenlit, but it required like the process being clear and open, like me following up with people, talking to people. And even if we said absolutely no, like it was transparent and open and clear process. That's actually how I met Joni of Podglomerate.
Oh, nice.
She was at a member station, I believe, in North Carolina at the time. She pitched me a series and it was really close to getting greenlit. And even though it didn't, I think her experience is like, here's someone who listened to my idea and had several meetings with, and they weren't, kind of jerking me around and let the door open, even though it wasn't yes to this project. And then shortly after I joined her project, we ended up staying greenlight Believe with Michigan Radio. And that was our first podcast we'd done with a member station. And it was massively successful.
What does that look like? Does NPR own that? Does the member station own it? Is there some kind of combo? How are you guys selling it? Does it all just get absorbed into the mothership and then like there's some amount of money that changes hands?
I can't remember exactly for Believe, but it's like, who is putting the most resources in? If it's like a shared amount of resources, then you can like co-own the feed, right? NPR, all the sales were handled by National Public Media, NPM, which is the sales arm for NPR. We hired a story editor to work alongside their editor, amazing Allison McAdams. And then we did all the marketing and promotion for it, although, of course, working in tandem with Michigan radio team. So it truly was like a real partnership.
Okay. I mean, that's amazing. And honestly, that in my much more limited than your experience is what provides the most success on a show.
Yeah.
Okay. So fast forward, you moved to Apple Podcasts in 2020. And what was your mandate in this new role?
Well, it's really funny because when you get recruited by Apple, you get recruited. They don't tell you what the job is.
And you always say yes.
Yeah, it was like head of content, Apple Podcasts. I'm like, that sounds amazing. And I thought I'm gonna do what I'm doing now at NPR, but with like Apple money. Because every show I did at NPR, which I loved, really felt like an exercise in digging through the couch cushions for change to make the show happen. So like, this is gonna be great. I'm going to Apple, I'm gonna have Apple money. And then go through the process and we get there. And really the mandate is, Apple Podcasts, we're a referee. We're not a player. But your role is to work with the other divisions at Apple and help them shape what their podcast strategy is going to be. So whether that's TV Plus, retail, music, books, news. So I was working with each of those divisions. And then additionally, this is when we're really in the thick of Apple Podcast subscriptions and bringing on external partners under NDA to tell them what it is, on board the idea of the subscription service, and then kind of launching it. So that was my mandate going in.
So around 2020, 2021, when Nigel was over at Apple, they just launched this paid subscription service. They're trying to onboard shows to use that to up engagement on the platform, to make a little bit of cash, to build a business model. And then simultaneously, they're launching shows that have to do with other services across the platform. Like you guys launched a podcast with Oprah for her new book club selection, which applied to Apple Books.
Hmm.
At this point in time, we saw a lot of kind of cross platform productions that were meant to expose people to each of the different services that were available. And from my vantage point, the largest kind of siloed piece here was that you all started to create podcasts that might be like rewatch or additive shows to a lot of like the Apple TV properties.
Hmm.
And today, that's what we see the most of from my vantage
Hmm.
point. Had this started when you were there?
Yeah, the Head Start, they were already in production of their first one, which is, I believe, the companion podcast for all mankind. And so that was still in production the first season when I got there. But then they're quickly starting to develop what would be the companion podcast for Foundation, which was the next TV series to have one.
Also had Jason Concepcion in it.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, Jason's a real
uh,
thread. I guess I've been following Jason.
yeah. Did you have Apple money to create all this stuff? Did it look really different than NPR?
No, no, it's really funny. I always tell people listening get shocked. I never spent a single dollar while I was at Apple.
Oh,
So, I work with like Kyle Wasserman has been leading a podcast, Apple TV Plus. And, Kyle has a budget. And so like, I'm almost like a conciliary for like Kyle, like, sitting in on pitch meetings, like, giving him my thoughts on shows while getting thoughts on pitches, kind of how to think about growing his slate. So like, he has money, right? Apple Books has money. All these other people have money. I don't have a budget or money.
okay. So you are in this like very powerful, unique position and also have no money to spend. So you're sitting in on these pitches. I'm sure there are people sending them directly to you. We didn't really touch on this with the NPR stuff, but we should spend a few minutes talking about like the DNA of a good pitch. When somebody brings a story to you, like what are some elements that you're looking for in terms of like deliverables that somebody like puts in your inbox? And then like within those deliverables, like what are some things that might
Yeah.
be like a little tangential that you're looking for?
Are we talking about ongoing shows or are we talking about a limited series, right? Because it's slightly different answer.
Let's do both.
Okay, so for a limited series, I really want to know what the story is, what the tone approach is, who do you need to tell this story? I need to see an access list, like who do you have already, who do you not have, like what can you get to them? I want to have an understanding of if it's 6 episodes, give me, it doesn't have to be super detailed, but like episode breakdown. And I don't even necessarily need to hear a sizzle, but even if you have like, this is a story about person A, okay, even if you've never recorded an interview with them, does any audio of them exist? Can I see? It's just so I get a standing of like, how does this person sound? The person's gonna be like kind of really anchoring the series. And then of course, you want to know how a series ends, which you may not know because you're still reporting, but like, give me like 3 possible ways in which this series could end that each kind of feel satisfying in some way. So that's what I want to see from that series. And for an ongoing show, to me, it's what's really, really key more than like what it is, the format. It's really like, what is the unique value proposition? Like, why is it that someone, if the average person listens to like 3 to 5 podcasts a week, what are we giving them in this show that will make them either add this show to their rotation or drop one of their shows and their rotation for this show? Because there's gonna be always a lot of demand on people's attention. What makes this series kind of rise to that level? And then the one thing I'll always say, I'm super, super wary of potential guest lists, especially if it's like an interview show. And even it's a matter of, we're like, I have the most high profile talent. Here's people in their Rolodex. Those people almost never come through. And so it's like, give me something that feels unique, that feels additive. If you're going to put, I love Nicole Byer, right? But like, Nicole Byer is in Cell. She's on everything. She's great. She has like 3 podcasts herself, right? So like, that's not going to make the show feel unique or
It's not going to
distinct.
be like unique
Yeah.
enough to bring in a zillion new
Yeah.
listeners,
Yeah.
you know, unless there's like a cool conceit behind it or something. But
Absolutely. Yeah. And a cool conceit can only take you so far, especially depending on like, can your host really pull that off or not? So yeah, those are the things I would look for.
there's only so many Jasons out there.
Yeah, that's right.
When somebody's pitching you, I'm sure you have a lot of like repeat customers and people that you know from the space, but how much are you weighing concept of the show versus the team that built the show versus the track record of the team that built the show?
It's interesting because at Wondery, a lot of it was like someone might have a great idea, but then we're bringing a production staff to it. So it's less important about the track record. But I think a track record is helpful, right? Sometimes I get pitched to people who've never worked in audio before. That's fine. But who are you? Who's going to be your producer or your editor? What has their work been like? This is really great. Or like, you've never done something in audio before, a podcast before, but man, you're an author and you're like the foremost expert in this. Or like, it's your story and you're compelling as hell to talk to. So you can only imagine what it's going to be like to get you behind the mic. And so past track record is really important, but doesn't have to be the be all end all.
Yeah, because I think about this a lot because it's like, and this is not the case. I'm only using this as an example, but like Dan Taberski comes to you and he's like, I have a new show. And I know he's like an amazing producer and has a lot to do with all of his shows, but assume it's somebody else. Would you immediately say, like, okay, how much of Missing Richard Simmons was Dan versus like Pineapple Street or something?
Sometimes then I will go to someone like a Pineapple or whoever was a producer editor and be like, okay, tell me, what was it like to do work with this person? And sometimes I'll be like, yeah, we really had to carry them all the way there. Or like, they're a great collaborator. Like, this is their strong suit. Get them a producer like this who can handle this part. And, you know, so I do a lot of like the due diligence of trying to figure out once I'm excited about something. What's it like to work with this person and what do they need to be actually successful?
So once you've greenlit a show, Dan Taberski comes to you and says, I want to do something on the history of, I don't know, Teletubbies or something. You're like, that's the show. We're going to do it. What is your role after you've signed the contract? What are you contributing to at that point?
I'm involved pretty early on in development, right? So then I'm really helping to further shape the show during development period, right? So how to make this series as strong as possible? Like, what are the gaps from the team do we need to fill? Who can really help to make this material the best? Like, really creating kind of focused goals that'll make us want to say at the end of development period, there's enough here to warrant a full series.
Is there like a production calendar that like you're looking at and saying, I need to see this on this day? Or is that something where you just kind of trust the partner that you're working with to like, keep you in the loop?
Oh no, I'm pretty in there, right? And so like, cause I mean, also there's a contract. Like, let's say it's a 8-week contract. I'm not gonna be like, see you in 2 months, right? It's
Yeah.
like, let's have a weekly meeting or a bi-weekly meeting. I want to see, a like a draft of a pilot episode at this point, and then I'm gonna get feedback, and then want time for you to revise it based on feedback, and then let's go through it again. And then because also what you're expecting from me is, and this is in contracts, right? A response within a certain amount of time. So I'm not leaving you hanging. So yeah.
This makes me feel great because this is exactly how we do it. Us normies over here. So we're we're doing something right. I love it. Okay, so you went in 2021 to Netflix.
Mhm.
Were you the first podcast development person at Netflix, or did you join an existing team?
I was the first head of audio and podcasts at Netflix, but there was a person, a trailblazer, who's responsible for podcasts at Netflix, and that's Ray Vada, who was on the marketing team at Netflix and had the great idea to start creating podcasts. When I joined, actually, Ray was on parental leave, and so it was a team of one. They had backfilled her position with David Moskowitz, who still works with Netflix. So it was always just like me and one other person until Ray came back and me and two other people. But yeah, I was the first head of audio that they hired.
So David is filling in for Ray. You join as head of audio. And at this point in time, Netflix has a handful of podcasts. They are creating some rewatch shows along with the content that's on the platform. And I think they already had Netflix as a joke, right?
They did.
Which excellent comedy, stand-up comedy, podcast for anybody who's interested. You come in, you see all of this. Where does your mind go? What are you trying to achieve at that point? And as an aside, what marks success? I know we talked about this a little bit with Apple, but Apple has these paid platforms that they're trying to promote. Netflix also has a paid platform, but like presumably people who are listening to podcasts about Netflix shows have already seen the show. What's the goal here?
There's the Netflix goal and there was my personal goals, right? The job of podcast at Netflix at the time was to market existing Netflix original content. That was really what the focus should be, right? And when I was getting recruited for the job, I told the person who would be my boss, listen, if you just want to keep doing companion podcasts, that is great. That's super fun. But I think it's gonna be a job that's better suited for someone else, right? Like, but if you're interested in eventually moving into originals as well, then yes, I'm the person for the job. And so she said, yes, come on. It won't be right away, but maybe like 6 months or a year down the line. It's like, great. Because for me, like, first of all, who wouldn't want to work for Netflix? But to me, I thought if Netflix could get into original podcasts, this would be like a dam breaker for the entire industry, right? We will have reached hopefully people finally who have never listened to podcasts before because Netflix reach is so huge because so have such a great promotional marketing arm. And I'm a firm believer that like a rising tide lifts all boats. And I was like, this is why I think it'll be crucial for industry. So I was coming obviously to work on companion podcasts, but my secret mission was to persuade Netflix to move into originals. And so, when I came in, there's some really great shows. Like you mentioned, Netflix is a joke, and You Can't Make This Up, which is a podcast, weekly podcast that's all about nonfiction true crime content on Netflix.
Hosted by Rebecca Lavoie, who is a former guest of this show.
I don't know how Rebecca does everything that she does. It's insane.
Rebecca's I'm from New Hampshire, so she is especially one of my favorite people.
And so one thing I saw is like, although there were companion shows, there are also shows that had nothing to do with Netflix content. So there's a great show as part of Strombeck Lead is the promotional brand that's geared towards the Black content for Black audiences at Netflix, right? And there's a great show called Okay Now Listen with two hosts that was so fun, right? But there wasn't sometimes overlap with Netflix content, right? So about doing a thorough evaluation of all these shows and making sure like they drive to this goal of promoting Netflix original content first, still within like what makes these shows special, but like that being consistent. All right. And there's some other consistency around like how often shows would publish, when they would publish. And so just bringing some more rigor and the kind of rigor you couldn't really do if you're just like a one-man band operation as it was before. And then really focus on growing those shows. And for shows that were already in development when I got there, again, really shaping them with those goals in mind. And then became really clear again because the goal for Netflix was like, I don't know, let's market these shows. It had not yet connected like the fact that this is about how you're engaging your content is continuing to engage people off platform, and that's really powerful. And I know like a podcast is not going to have the same amount of listens as like I don't know or views as like an episode of Virgin River, which is like surprisingly one of the biggest shows of all time at Netflix, right? But it still means a significant portion of people's day continues to be consumed with Netflix, even if it's not on platform. And they're consuming at a different time, right? Like People don't really watch Netflix in the morning as they're getting ready to work, but they'll listen to this podcast about their favorite show on Netflix.
And it's fostering super fans and word of mouth and bringing people back and dinner time conversation and all the things. What are the metrics that you guys were looking at the time that you would use to define success?
So me is about time spent, right? Which is important in podcasting, right? But was really, I think, important in terms of Netflix. So how many additional hours were people spending on the content? Like we started doing these limited series that we would bet into the You Can't Make This Up feed. So we did one for the Tindler Swindler, which was like the first documentary film that ever hit number one worldwide. And the series was different than a doc because the series was like the origin story. Like how did this guy actually become like go with his swindler ways, which was never covered in the film. So we'll say like I can't remember the numbers offhand, but like this many more hours of content were consumed for the show than what you could have ever anticipated for. So that was like the biggest metric of success for us.
And I know this is after your time, but like a lot of what Netflix is doing now is trying to get into sports content or doing after shows for on YouTube for Squid Game, for example, all of which is meant to continue to develop the IP that they have and foster new communities. And as you experience with NPR and with Apple, how to bring in new audiences. What is your viewpoint of bringing podcasts onto Netflix, onto on platform, as you guys call it?
Yeah. I am in full support of podcasts being on Netflix. That being said, I'm not a fan of this exclusivity that they demand. I don't think it's helpful overall for podcasting and the industry itself for these creators who are going to be signing this deal. I think it's challenging. You're having to kind of start over elsewhere and move your audience over. You may not get them back if the deal were to lapse. Netflix is not known for being the most transparent in terms of sharing numbers. And I think we've seen over years, Netflix has had a lot of challenges around talk format content, right? Whether that is Hassan Minaj's show or Michelle Wolf. There's a lot of previous talk show content on Netflix that didn't last long. That kind of content struggles on Netflix already with really big names, right? And not that these shows that are bringing on aren't big names, but I just worry that these shows will have a similar struggle getting audience on this platform.
And in 2023, you moved over to Wondery. I know you were in charge of co-productions over there and eventually, serials. And you were there up until earlier this year when Wondery, went under. I know that we've spent a lot of time talking about development, but like I think it's really important to also talk about what your role was at Wondery and what Wondery's particular set of business problems were. Obviously, one of the largest publishers out there, but also Wondery had Wondery Plus, which according to at least one previous guest of this show, had something like 400,000 paying subscribers on that platform. So that actually opened up the doors for you guys to greenlight a lot more things than you may otherwise have been able to, presumably. What did that particular cocktail of decision making look like at Wondery?
Yeah.
What were the kinds of things that you were trying to make?
You're looking for shows and limited series, 'cause I only worked on limited series that are really strong stories with unexpected twists and turns that will reach a broad audience, meet download goals, right? Also have high potential for IP development, right? Which Wondery, I don't think anyone in that company could hold a candle to the number of projects that were developed for TV and film, and would be good for Wondery Plus, both retaining existing subscribers and hopefully acquiring new subscribers. So that's kind of the overall mandate. And I think one of the challenges as well, because as head of co-production when I started, a lot of it was like work with newsrooms to source these stories, right? Wondery done work previously with LA Times, with Bloomberg. We had just announced first look deal with Advanced Local Media, which owns newspapers and websites in like 16 different markets. And so, as someone who went to journalism school, has worked for journalism organizations, like this is great. But also, it's like it's hard. It is really hard. And as much as we were talking about earlier, 2020 was like the boom times. 2023 was already the lean times, right? So I started having a conversation with a newsroom, and turns out they are having layoffs. And the people I was talking to were laid off. I cannot tell you how many times that happened.
2022, 2023 was brutal.
It was brutal. Yeah. As you can imagine, like, newsrooms you think could move fast because they have to move fast because news, like, Now when it comes to legal stuff or like building trust that allows you to kind of have deeply embedded partnerships. So, you work with somebody like, this is great. And then you're like, well, now there's new managers and new publishers. So it really made it,
And even if they're amazing, it's like starting over every time.
it's starting over every time. So that was, I think, what some of the challenge. And I will say that, like, I felt like I was running away for layoffs, right? Like, Apple doesn't lay off, right? But like at Netflix, I survived 3 rounds of layoffs in 6 weeks. NPR had layoffs a year and a half after I left. Even though I was wondering, Wondery didn't have layoffs at the time, Amazon Music had layoffs. They had this whole investment in AMP, which is the Clubhouse. Remember Clubhouse? Competitor. So, like, layoffs were all around us. So I was like, okay, it's going to come for Wondery at some point just because we work for Amazon. But it did feel like a really secure place, right? Because they did have a model that really seemed to work between a mix of subscriptions, IP, and sales, but not wholly reliant only on one.
From an outsider's perspective, like if anybody was going to make this work, it was Wondery and Amazon and Art19 and everything. And to be honest, I think that it did work. It was also a drop in the bucket for Amazon's broader
Yeah,
business. So
yeah.
you were a part of the latest round of layoffs at Wondery, or the layoff at
hmm
Wondery. And since then, you laid out your own shingle. Will you tell us a little bit about Type C Studios?
Yeah. So I always said to myself and to my family, like, all right, when did you be my last corporate job? First of all, where do you go after you work for Amazon, Netflix, and Apple? But I really felt like I wanted to do just some, either maybe not in audio at all anymore, maybe go back to public television at all. But I just felt like it was going to be my last job. And then after the layoffs, I just had this idea, like probably within that same week, like I I loved what I was doing. I loved the team I was working with. I didn't feel done, but I was done with the idea of going to another company and either trying to execute a vision that may not be reachable, or a vision that I didn't quite agree with, or leadership that I didn't quite agree with. And I was like, let me put my money where my mouth is. Like, if I think I can do better, do better. Let me start my own thing. And so I started Type C Studios. So, most people are familiar with the type A or B personality types, but there's actually like 5 or 6 different personality types. And Type C personalities are people who are creative, collaborative, and bring organization to chaos, which I feel like really defines who I am. And
I love that.
so
I've not heard that.
thank you. Yeah, it's great. Also, I got it from an Instagram video because there's Type C moms, right? Because I'm a mom. There's Type C moms who are like, you do all the great, beautiful organization things and all these fun activities, and you try to stick to it, but then once your toddler makes a mess, you're like, and that's just that. That's it. Like, I'm not gonna be like so rigid about it. So yeah, started Type C Studios with actually 2 of my colleagues. So Anela Reyes, who really headed up a lot of our marketing efforts at Wondery, and I was previously at like Paramount and Nickelodeon and Viacom, and Tanja Thigpen, who headed up our video podcast at Wondery. But also, I hired Tanja at Apple Podcasts and convinced her to kind of move from music industry to the podcast industry. And so, between the 3 of us, we are doing consulting on editorial, production, managed optimization, video podcasts, marketing, but also doing production for hire. So it's really exciting. I mean, we're brand new. We start in November, but we already have several clients, and really excited about the what we're building, how we want to figure out a different way to operate, and a way that really respects people, and as individuals, everything we have to kind of manage personal life and the work without burning each other out, burning anyone else out, and really committed to narrative audio and how do you make it sustainable. Thank
Congratulations. This
you.
is a huge step. And the hardest part is just saying that you're going to do it.
Yeah.
So kudos to you
Yeah.
and to the whole team. It's very cool. So how do you make narrative work?
Yeah. That's an ongoing question. All right. And I do think, like, the lessons I've learned from the different places I've worked at is you really have to think about how to leverage the resources available to you and try to do the work in a way that's lean but sustainable. And think about distribution as, like, I think the days of dropping something in a solo feed and then hoping for the best or putting a ton of marketing dollars is kind of behind. And it's really about thinking about these shows, either it's limited series or mini seasonal shows, is really just like this brand that has to be multi-platform. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it now. I'm trying to orient the work around it.
I'm also curious about how this works when you are considering bringing video into the mix.
I have a client right now that I'm working with that is actually prior to our formation of our business, but they're working with Athletic on developing some shows with them. And it's really different than what I've done working the last couple of years because these aren't limited series, they're ongoing weekly shows with a video component. And but the great thing about Athletic is like they're already doing video podcasts. So it's not like having to convince them why it's important and it's like how to get it done. And the other thing that's really interesting for the Athletic is like they publish shows that are multiple times a week, right? Some shows, 3 or 4 times a week, especially depending on what sport they cover and in season. And so it's also thinking about like how do you create a concept that is flexible enough to allow for multiple episodes a week, especially if it's not something that's super driven by news. So that's been really interesting. And I think when it comes to video and narrative shows, that's really important to me. It's something I was really focusing on my last few months at Wondery. My frustration with the industry is that when we saw that more and more things moving on to YouTube, that's where younger listeners were, that's where more diverse audiences were. We started developing shows for YouTube, right? But talk shows. And it's like, okay, but how do you then get that audience to want to learn to like and love narrative shows, right? Are we expecting them like, okay, now I'm 28. I'm an old person now. So let me go over to, Apple Podcasts and listen to a podcast there. No, you have to create these things where they're at right now. And so to me, that's a big area which we're putting our focus on for Type C Studios is how do we make narrative video shows that are engaging, but not a super heavy lift production wise, not just basically starting to make documentary films because I don't think they're interchangeable and cost effective. So that's been a really big focus for us. And right now, we just put together a pitch for a creator who has a huge TikTok audience and wants to expand to longer narrative video podcast. But it's exciting. It's an exciting challenge, right? Because at least here's a creator who already is in the space, but just doesn't do long form. So how do we marry the things that they're already really good at as a creator on these platforms with narrative? So how do we do that in a way that feels authentic to him, authentic to his audience, but is sustainable in terms of like production workload and workflow?
Are you hiring? I'd love to work on that stuff.
Maybe we'll see if we'll get the job.
You are focused on some of the most interesting areas in podcasting right now. And I'm a broken record when it comes to this, but it is very clear that the most listened to shows are the really well done narrative podcasts. It is equally clear that the only things that the bigger organizations care to monetize is the weekly chat shows. And there seems to be an enormous disconnect there, and nobody seems to be trying to address it.
Yeah.
I'm guilty. I am very much working on whatever projects come through our door as opposed to doing something about it. So I'm glad that you are trying because because then I get to watch and see. And I do think it's very impressive what you've done over the years, and I cannot wait to see what you do here. If any of our listeners want to follow along, where should they do that?
Sure. You can reach out to me via email. It's my name, NJERI at typecstudios.com. Instagram and LinkedIn, which is my full name, Niger Eaton. And we have a website, but it is a pretty bland Squarespace landing page. But maybe by the time this airs, it will no longer be that. typecstudios.com.
Well, this is incredible. And thank you so much for joining us. I wasn't joking. I've wanted to talk to you for years. So I'm glad that we finally got to do it on camera.
Yeah, me too.
And we'll genuinely do this again very soon because I want to hear how all this goes.
Yeah, and I'm unleashed because you tried to get me earlier. If any of these places let me do it, there would have been a PR rep on the call being like, she can't answer that. Nigeria, don't answer that. So
amazing. Well, thank you, Nigeria. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. To find Nigeria Eaton online, you can look her up on LinkedIn or head to typecstudios.com. For more podcast-related news, info, and takes, you can follow me on LinkedIn at Jeff Umbro. Podcast Perspectives is a production of the Podglomerate. If you're looking for help producing, marketing, or monetizing your podcast, you can find us at podglomerate.com, shoot us an email at listen@thepodglomerate.com, or follow us on all socials at Podglomerate Pods. This episode was produced by Chris Boniello and myself, Jeff Umbro. This episode was edited and mixed by Jose Roman. And thank you so much to the marketing team, Joni Deutsch, Madison Richards, Morgan Swift, Aaron Weiss, and Sheba Joseph.
And a special thank you to Dan Christo. Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you all in a few weeks.